I've spent a good portion of my life watching America wrestle with itself, our politics, our differences, our hopes that somehow we'll come out of it a little wiser. When I turned on the television this morning and saw a CNN anchor struggling to explain what just happened, a fiery speech by Zoran Mamdani, that seemed to send ripples across social media, and news of Donald Trump celebrating his 24th courtroom victory, I thought about how we got here. How fear and spectacle have become substitutes for understanding. It's tempting to look at this moment and treat it like another episode in a never-ending political drama. The shouting, the viral clips, the instant outrage, they draw us in. But beneath all that noise, something more profound is happening. People are trying to reclaim a sense of agency. Mamdani's speech, whether you agree with him or not, struck a nerve because it wasn't the usual cautious political rhetoric. It was conviction, raw and unfiltered, and it reminded viewers that the microphone doesn't always belong to the most powerful man in the room. Meanwhile, Trump's latest legal triumph, number 24, according to his supporters, feeds into a narrative he's been building for years, the outsider under siege who keeps defying the odds. It's a story that works because it taps into resentment and the feeling that the system is rigged against people like us. And when that story is repeated enough, when it becomes the soundtrack of an entire movement, it doesn't really matter what the facts are. What matters is the emotional payoff of watching your champion win again. The CNN host, visibly uneasy, became part of that story. Every pause, every stammer, every attempt to pivot away from the confrontation was replayed, clipped, and shared across the internet. That's the new political battlefield. Not the halls of Congress, but the split-screen moment when fear and defiance collide on live TV. Now, I've been on both sides of that camera. I know what it's like when your words are dissected before you've even finished the sentence. So I don't mock anyone for being rattled. But I do think we should ask, why are we so drawn to fear in our politics? Why do we click the clip that shows someone flustered instead of the one that explains the policy? Because outrage is easy. Fear is familiar. And unity, real unity, takes patience. When Mamdani raised his voice about inequality and power, he was channeling a long tradition in American politics, from the labor activists of the 1930s to the civil rights organizers of the 1960s. The language changes. The faces change, but the fight is the same. Who gets hurt? And who gets left behind? The irony is that while his words made headlines for their tone, the content was a plea for empathy, the very thing that seems to be missing from our national conversation. On the other hand, Trump's win represents the other side of that emotional equation, vindication. His followers don't just see a man escaping legal peril. They see themselves beating the system that told them they were wrong. Each court victory becomes proof that defiance works, that you can bend the rules if the rules were never fair to begin with. That kind of story has power. And if we ignore it or dismiss it as irrational, we lose the opportunity to understand what drives it. When I listen to these competing narratives, I hear echoes of something older, the struggle between order and change, between the establishment and the insurgent. It's not new, but it feels more dangerous today because our information systems amplify the extremes and flatten the nuance. A speech becomes a soundbite. A court ruling becomes a meme. And somewhere in that translation, the truth gets lost. If I were sitting across from that CNN host, I'd tell them this. You don't have to be scared of conviction. You just have to be prepared for it. Journalism isn't about managing emotions. It's about seeking clarity. And the best clarity comes not from avoiding tension, but from walking straight through it. What Mamdani's rise shows us, and what Trump's persistence underscores, is that America is hungry for stories of authenticity, even if they come wrapped in chaos. People are tired of being managed. They want to be moved. The challenge for the rest of us, the journalists, the voters, the leaders, is to find a way to separate emotion from exploitation. Because when fear becomes the lens through which we see everything, democracy becomes a performance, not a process. And I think no. I know that we can do better than that. When I left the White House, I knew I was stepping away from the constant roar, the news cycle that spins faster than most people can breathe. Yet the noise never really stops. It just changes pitch. This week, as the cameras replayed Mamdani's speech and the ticker below announced Trump's 24th courtroom win, I could feel the same old rhythm: outrage, applause, denial, repeat. But beneath that rhythm, I could also hear an echo, the sound of a country talking past itself. I remember sitting in situation room briefings where facts were sacred. Every sentence had to be verified, every assumption tested. Today, in the court of public opinion, the only test that matters is whether a story feels true. That's what worries me most about where we are now: the ease with which perception replaces principle. When Mamdani thundered against corruption and inequality, his words caught fire because they struck that emotional chord. When Trump declared victory again, his supporters didn't ask for transcripts. They celebrated the symbol. Two sides, both convinced the other is blind, both absolutely certain they alone can see. That CNN host, the one everyone's mocking, wasn't just reacting to a speech. They were reacting to the weight of that echo chamber pressing on them from both sides. Every pause was magnified, every blink turned into proof of bias. And you can't anchor a conversation like that. You can only surf it until the next wave crashes. I've often said democracy isn't self-executing. It requires constant care, a willingness to assume good faith even when it's hard. But that's becoming a tougher sell when good faith doesn't trend. What trends is confrontation. And so, political storytelling has become less about persuading the undecided and more about thrilling the already convinced. That's not just unhealthy. It's unsustainable. Still, I don't dismiss what drives it. I grew up watching communities that felt unseen by Washington. The factory worker in the Midwest, the immigrant cab driver in Queens, the young activist organizing from a rented room in the Bronx, they all crave acknowledgement. They want to believe their voices matter. Mamdani's defiance speaks to that hunger. So does Trump's defiant grin after each legal win. Different languages, same craving for recognition. The irony is that both movements, in their own ways, expose the fragility of the institutions I once tried to defend. The courts, the press, the political parties, they all depend on a baseline of trust. Chip away at that trust long enough, and even truth starts to look like propaganda. You can see it in how people watch the news now, not to learn, but to confirm. If the host looks scared, that's proof the system's cracking. If they stay calm, that's proof they're complicit. It's a rigged game with no off-ramp. I'm not naive enough to think we can rewind to some mythical era of civility. But I do think we can start by listening again, really listening, to the stories behind the shouting. Because what Mamdani said, beneath the firebrand language, was that people deserve a fair shake. And what Trump's base shouts beneath the grievance is that they don't trust anyone to give it to them. That's not insanity. That's despair weaponized. When I was president, I used to read 10 letters from Americans every night. It was my reminder that behind every statistic was a life. A single mother working 2 jobs. A veteran wondering why the country he served felt distant. A teenager asking whether hope was still real. Reading those letters kept me honest and humble. Now, as I watch the country argue itself hoarse, I wonder who's reading the letters now. The CNN host looked frightened, yes. But maybe that fear isn't weakness. Maybe it's recognition. Because deep down, journalists can sense the same thing politicians do, that the social contract is fraying. When the audience stops believing in the messenger, truth itself becomes negotiable. So, what happens when belief collapses? History gives us plenty of warnings. Societies start choosing strongmen over systems. They trade dialogue for dominance. They mistake disruption for renewal. And by the time they realize what they've lost, the institutions that could save them are already hollowed out. That's why moments like this, a speech, a court ruling, a nervous anchor, matter more than we admit. They're snapshots of a nation deciding whether to rebuild trust or abandon it. I still believe most Americans, regardless of party, want to rebuild it. They're tired of chaos dressed as courage. They want stability, but not stagnation, progress, but not pandemonium. And I suspect that's why Mamdani's passion resonates even among skeptics. It reminds them that conviction doesn't have to mean cruelty. It can mean caring enough to fight for something larger than yourself. As for Trump's latest victory, I won't pretend it doesn't shift the political ground again. Every legal triumph becomes another chapter in his myth of invincibility. But myths have a way of collapsing under their own weight. So, the question isn't how many cases he wins, it's whether the country still believes winning in court is the same as winning in conscience. The CNN host didn't have an answer. Neither do most of us, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, fear on camera is a sign that the stakes are finally sinking in, that what we're watching isn't just another viral moment, but a reckoning with what we've allowed politics to become. If that's true, then the fear isn't the problem. It's the beginning of awareness. And awareness, however uncomfortable, is the first step toward courage. I've often said that politics, at its best, is about making people's lives better. But in this age, it's become a performance, a long-running show where every player fights for screen time. Watching CNN scramble after Mamdani's speech while social media lit up with Trump's 24th legal win, I couldn't help thinking, we've turned the news into theater and the audience into an army. Now, don't misunderstand me. The press is vital. A free press is the lifeblood of democracy. But somewhere along the line, the business of informing people became the business of keeping them hooked. You can't sell calm. You can't monetize nuance. So instead, networks feed us adrenaline disguised as awareness. Every headline has to shock. Every debate must feel like the end of the world. The public doesn't even notice anymore. They've grown addicted to the hit. That's how a single speech by a little-known legislator becomes a firestorm. Mamdani's words weren't new. He spoke of housing, wealth, power, justice, the same issues Americans have argued about for decades. But the delivery, the defiance, the moment was what mattered. The cameras lingered. The anchor flinched. That combination of passion and discomfort made for perfect television. And the algorithm, that invisible hand shaping what millions see, decided it was gold. Then came the other side of the coin, Trump's celebration. The clips of him smiling, fists raised, declaring yet another legal victory, replayed across conservative media with the precision of a campaign ad. It wasn't just reporting. It was choreography. The image was crafted to feed a story of resilience and persecution. And once again, people clicked, commented, and argued, fueling both sides of the same machine. The irony here is almost poetic. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they all claim to hate one another's narratives, yet they're partners in the same emotional economy. Fear and triumph. Rage and relief. Each segment is a dose of dopamine designed to keep you coming back. What's being lost is the middle, the quiet, complicated truth that doesn't sell but sustains a democracy. I've seen how powerful storytelling can be. During my campaigns, we used it to give hope shape, to make ordinary people believe their voices could bend history. But the kind of storytelling that dominates politics today doesn't build. It consumes. It's fast food for the mind. It fills you, but leaves you weaker. And that's the trap. Outrage is easy to summon. but nearly impossible to sustain without consequence. When the public is constantly told the world is ending, they stop believing anything can be fixed. They tune out or they turn on one another. Both outcomes serve those who profit from division. I remember a night in 2009, sitting in the Oval Office, watching the coverage of the financial crisis. People were angry, and rightly so. They'd lost homes, jobs, savings. But the anger wasn't the problem. The problem was where that anger was directed. It didn't always flow toward the institutions that caused the harm. It turned inward, community against community. That's the moment the spectacle became more powerful than the story. What we're witnessing now? Mamdani's viral moment. Trump's defiant celebration is part of that same lineage. The performance has replaced the purpose. Politicians no longer speak to persuade. They perform to provoke. Media outlets don't inform to enlighten. They amplify to inflame. And the audience, conditioned by years of digital adrenaline, demands the next act before the last one ends. I don't blame people for feeling exhausted. I feel it too. There's a certain fatigue that comes from watching the same script play out over and over. Fear, outrage, distraction, repeat. But the danger is that fatigue can harden into cynicism. And cynicism is how democracies die quietly, not with coups or chaos, but with shrugs. The CNN host's fear in that viral moment wasn't just about being caught off guard. It was the realization that truth no longer guarantees safety. Once upon a time, journalists could rely on facts to shield them. Now, even accuracy can be a liability if it disrupts the narrative their audience prefers. And that's a heavy burden. Knowing your job is to inform, but your survival depends on engagement. I sometimes wonder what would happen if, for just one day, every network stopped chasing outrage and started explaining complexity. If they treated the audience like citizens again instead of consumers. It wouldn't be flashy. Ratings might drop. But maybe, just maybe, people would start feeling something they haven't in a long time. Trust. Because trust, once lost, takes generations to rebuild. And right now, both sides of the spectrum are spending it like it's endless. I'm not saying everyone in media is complicit. There are still journalists fighting to tell the truth, even when it costs them. But they're swimming upstream in a current by clicks and fear. They need allies, not applause. They need citizens willing to say, "We'll listen," even if it's uncomfortable. Mamdani's speech, for all its fury, carried a challenge, not just to the establishment, but to us. To stop treating outrage as entertainment. To remember that democracy isn't a spectacle. It's a conversation. And that conversation is dying because we've replaced listening with reacting. When I hear people ask, "Why does everything feel so unstable?" I tell them, it's because we're mistaking noise for movement. We're mistaking the show for the substance. And until we learn the difference again, we'll keep tuning into the same rerun, expecting a different ending. The cameras will roll, the pundits will argue, and the headlines will scream. But real change, the kind that sticks, will never fit into a viral clip. It takes patience. It takes empathy. It takes truth spoken softly enough to be heard, and courage loud enough to be believed. That's not theater. That's democracy. If you stand far enough back, the distance between left and right starts to blur. The anger sounds different, but the echo is the same. Watch Mamdani thunder against billionaires and injustice, and then watch Trump rail against elites and conspiracies. You can feel the shared heartbeat beneath the slogans. Both speak to people who believe power has forgotten them. Both promise to tear something down in order to feel whole again. That's the paradox of modern populism. Two movements staring at each other across a divide. Convinced they're enemies, when in truth, they're reflections in a cracked mirror. When I first ran for office, I believed optimism was contagious. That if you show people a better future, they run toward it. Now I see how fear can be contagious too. Faster, louder, more viral. It spreads not through speeches, but through screens. Every scroll, every notification, every headline whispering. They're lying to you. The left hears it. The right hears it. And both feel vindicated. Mamdani's speech reminded me of the early days of organizing on the south side of Chicago. We held meetings in church basements where people shouted, cried, sometimes argued until midnight. But underneath all that noise was love. The love of community, of wanting to be seen by a city that never looked our way. When I watched him speak, I saw that same energy, a conviction that politics should still belong to ordinary people. Yet I also saw the danger that conviction can turn brittle. That righteous anger can forget what it's fighting for once it becomes performance. Trump's movement has its own mirror version of that passion. Fierce, tribal, absolute. He gives his followers a story in which they are the last defenders of a vanishing America, the only ones brave enough to fight back against a faceless establishment. It's intoxicating. I've met some of those folks. Many are good people who love their country, but feel invisible in it. They're not driven by hate so much as by loss, of status, of certainty, of meaning. And when you've lost enough, even chaos can start to look like hope. That's what worries me. Because when belonging becomes conditional, when it's built on who we stand against instead of what we stand for, it stops healing and starts dividing. The crowd cheering Mamdani's defiance and the crowd roaring at Trump's defiance are both trying to fill the same hole. A hunger for connection in a culture that monetizes isolation. The media amplifies that hunger, feeds it, packages it. Every viral moment becomes proof that our side is finally winning. But winning what? If all we're left with is more division, more suspicion, more walls between neighbors, then even victory tastes bitter. I don't say this as criticism. I say it as confession. I spent 8 years in the Oval Office trying to bridge that divide. Some days we made progress. Some days I failed. There were moments when I could feel the country pulling apart beneath my feet, the social fabric stretching until it trembled. And I've learned that laws can't mend it. Only empathy can. You can't legislate belonging. You have to build it, person by person. Mamdani speaks from the language of justice. Trump speaks from the language of grievance. Both resonate because Americans sense that something essential is slipping away. Trust in one another, belief in institutions, faith that tomorrow can be better than today. Those aren't partisan losses. They're human ones. I think about the faces in those town halls I used to visit. The factory worker in Wisconsin who said his job went overseas. The immigrant nurse in Queens who felt invisible despite working 12-hour shifts. The teacher in Georgia fighting to keep her classroom from collapsing under budget cuts. They didn't all agree on policy, but they all wanted the same thing: dignity. And dignity is the one currency politics keeps devaluing. When the CNN host froze on camera, maybe it wasn't fear of a guest or a headline. Maybe it was the recognition that they, too, are part of this mirror, caught between outrage and understanding, between serving truth and surviving the algorithm. It's a hard place to stand, but it's where the real work begins. The truth is, America has always lived in this tension, between self-interest and solidarity, between myth and reality. What's new is how immediate it all feels. The mirror is no longer abstract. It's in our pockets, lighting up every few seconds with reminders of who we're supposed to hate. I sometimes wonder what would happen if, instead of chasing the next scandal, we paused long enough to ask, why do so many of us feel so powerless? Because that question, not who's winning or losing today, holds the key to our future. Powerlessness breeds resentment. Resentment breeds extremism. And extremism, left unchecked, eventually devours its own. If there's a path out of this, it won't come from shouting louder. It'll come from looking into that mirror, really looking, and admitting that we're all complicit in the show. That outrage without purpose is just noise. And that the people we've turned into villains might be telling us something we need to hear, even if we don't like the way they say it. Mamdani's words, Trump's grin, the anchor's fear, they're not random moments. They're reflections of a deeper national identity crisis. Who are we when we stop performing? Who are we when the cameras turn off? I still believe the answer is hopeful. Because beneath the noise, I see people volunteering, helping neighbors, standing in line to vote, still trying to make sense of the mess together. They're not the loudest voices, but they're the ones who keep the country alive. The mirror might be cracked, but it still shows us who we are and who we could be. If we chose to see clearly again, when I was younger, I believed change moved like lightning. You organize, you speak, you march, and something shifts. Age teaches you that change moves more like a tide, slow, deliberate, retreating before it advances. But it does move. It always does. And that's what I remind myself as I watch the country wrestle with another week of chaos. A fiery speech here, a courtroom victory there, a nervous anchor caught between them. All of it proof that we're still arguing over who we are. That argument, noisy as it is, means the story isn't over. The easy thing to do would be to choose a side and settle in. The left will point to Mamdani's passion as proof that justice still breathes in the body politic. The right will raise Trump's 24th win like a banner, proof that defiance still triumphs over establishment power. But both camps, if they're honest, will admit they're not winning so much as surviving. Because survival has become the new success metric in politics. Who can withstand the outrage the longest? Who can turn backlash into brand? What worries me isn't the anger itself. Democracy has always been messy. What worries me is the fatigue underneath it. The sense that people have stopped believing change is possible unless it's instantaneous or viral. We've confused attention with achievement. And when attention fades, cynicism fills the void. Still, I don't believe this moment is hopeless. I've seen too many people rise after being written off. I've seen neighborhoods rebuild after tragedy, movements rekindle after failure, and yes, even opponents find common ground when the cameras weren't rolling. The truth is, America's story has never been one of perfection. It's a story of correction. We stumble, we argue, we fight, and somehow, through all the noise, we find our footing again. What gives me hope isn't the speeches or the verdicts or the viral clips. It's the quiet work happening beyond them. The young organizers knocking on doors. The teachers holding open classrooms. The journalists still checking facts even when it costs them followers. These folks aren't chasing spectacle. They're rebuilding trust brick by brick, conversation by conversation. They remind us that progress doesn't need a trending hashtag. It needs endurance, but we can't rebuild trust without truth. And truth, in times like these, can feel endangered. When every network frames the same story differently, when every algorithm tailors outrage to taste, when every conversation starts with suspicion, telling the truth feels like shouting into a hurricane. Yet that's exactly when it matters most. The real test of democracy isn't how it behaves when it's comfortable. It's how it behaves when it's scared. Right now, we're scared. Scared of losing jobs, culture, control, identity. Fear is natural. The danger is when leaders start feeding it instead of facing it. Because fear makes us forget that we share more than we think. The same air, the same roads, the same children growing up with screens brighter than stars. When I see Mamdani's anger, I recognize it. It's the anger of a generation inheriting a system they didn't break but must fix. When I see Trump's defiance, I recognize that too. The defiance of a man who understands that in a divided country, conviction, even if misplaced, is a currency. But neither anger nor defiance will build the bridge we need. Only empathy will. And empathy doesn't trend. It takes time. There's a story I keep coming back to. During my presidency, a woman once told me she'd voted for me twice, but didn't think I'd changed her life. I asked her what she meant. She said, "My town's still poor. My son still can't find a good job." I told her I understood, and I did. Because the truth is, progress isn't measured by headlines or even by elections. It's measured by whether people feel seen. If they don't, no policy in the world can reach them. That's what both Mamdani and Trump are tapping into. The ache of invisibility. But here's the thing. Seeing each other doesn't mean agreeing. It means acknowledging that the person shouting across from you isn't the problem. The distance is. We can shorten that distance in our homes, in our communities, in our conversations, if we decide that democracy is still worth the work. It's not glamorous. It's not fast. It's often thankless. But it's the only way forward. So, as the networks spin, as the courtrooms fill, as the speeches go viral and fade, I keep faith in something quieter. That America, for all its noise, still knows how to listen when it matters most. We've done it before. We can do it again. The question is whether we'll choose to, and if we do. If we manage to look past the mirror and see the person reflected there, not as an enemy, but as a fellow traveler, then maybe this storm of outrage will give way to something better. Not perfect, not pure, but possible. Because possibility is the one thing they can't televise, can't indict, can't spin. It's what we carry with us when the headlines fade and the cameras move on. That's where I find my hope. Not in the noise, but in the spaces between it. The long, steady work of a people still trying, against all odds, to come home to one another.